Good morning and welcome to NOW's 2021 Racial Justice Summit. I'm Christian Nunes, president of NOW, and we are so pleased to have you here today, along with our distinguished guests and panelists. Last year, we were able to gather in person on Capitol Hill. And while we can't be here together physically this time, we are very grateful for the opportunity to gather virtually. Now, to get things started, we are very pleased and honored to bring to you our very featured keynote and guest speaker, Congresswoman Robin Kelly. Congresswoman Robin Kelly was elected to serve the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois in 2013, where she worked to expand economic opportunity, reduce health disparities, and end gun violence. A staunch champion of common sense gun reform and responsible community policing, she authored the first ever congressional analysis of national gun violence epidemic, offering a blueprint for ending the crisis. She is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust and co-chairs the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls. Prior to her election to Congress, Kelly was a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. Please help me welcome Congressional Member Robin Kelly as she comes to us as our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and good morning. I am Congresswoman Robin Kelly, and I proudly represent the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois. I do serve on the House and Energy Commerce Committee, just elected vice chair of that very auspicious House committee, but I also serve on the Health Subcommittee. As was said, I'm also the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus Health Brain Trust. And once, I have to reflect on this, a very proud member of the Peoria Planned Parenthood. I was a board member. It's great to be here with hardworking, committed women and men who support reproductive rights. Because of your hard work, we retook the White House, the Senate, and elected a pro-choice majority in the House. So thank you all so very much. And we arrived at a critical moment when reproductive rights have never been more at risk. This year marks 48 years since Roe v. Wade was established the legal right to abortion. Yet today, nearly a half century later, abortion access is out of reach for many women, across the country. Since 2011, more than 480 abortion restrictions have been enacted in states across the country, making abortion inaccessible for people with low incomes and especially Black and brown people. Politicians should not be able to deny people the care they need just because of who they are, where they live, or how much they earn. Since 1976, Congress has used the Hyde Amendment to deny insurance coverage of abortion services for people working to make ends meet. And in the last 10 years, anti-abortion politicians have passed hundreds of laws to shut down clinics and make it harder to provide care. These policies mostly harm communities who are already treated unjustly by our healthcare system, especially Black and brown women. When a woman wants to get an abortion but is denied, she more likely is to fall into poverty. Restricting Medicaid coverage of abortion forces 1 in 4 poor women seek an abortion to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. Access to abortion is being threatened like never before. The barriers to abortion care are increased by systemic racism, economic insecurity, and immigration status. Despite our wins in the legislative and executive branches, we've never been at a more dangerous crossroads with 3 Trump nominees confirmed to the Supreme Court. About 19 abortion cases are only a step away from being heard by the Supreme Court. The threat of Roe being overturned or gutted is very real. If the Supreme Court is working to undermine reproductive rights, then the legislature must act. I, along with my colleagues in Congress, are committed to ending the Hyde Amendment in the federal spending bill, and I am encouraged the Biden administration will work right alongside with us. We're working to create a future where women are able to make decisions about our health and our future with dignity and respect. We cannot go backwards. Leaving the vital decisions of health and family to the precarious balance of the court creates instability for thousands of American families. Our reproductive rights cannot depend solely on the next Supreme Court appointment. I support legislation that codifies fundamental reproductive rights and protects these rights from erosions by the courts. It's entirely too risky to leave women's access to comprehensive health care up to the whims of this Supreme Court or what might be future Supreme Courts. And I do this and say this and feel this with my own mother in mind, who, when she was very young, had to get an abortion, and it was a backroom abortion. And I never want to see things like that happen again. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your advocacy. Please know that your work is sorely needed, and we need your voices in every level of government. So thank you so much again, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Kelly, for those thought-provoking words and that commitment that you have demonstrated to women and girls, and just the intersectional demonstration you've shown in the legislation that you're passing. We thank you for your time today and coming out on your busy schedule.
Thank you.
Thank you. So today's event, we are super excited because we really are talking about the intersects of gender, health, technology, violence, and race. Racial justice is an issue for everyone. Our panels will offer thought-provoking discussions that seek to answer some of the most pressing questions and challenging questions facing our society. They will also raise new questions and discussions about how to move forward in a deeply divided country where racist rhetoric has become normalized and violence and hate are displayed on our phones and TV screens daily. So we really want to make sure that we are taking our time now to really address these issues. Just last month, at the same site where we held our last Racial Justice Summit 1 year ago, Confederate flags were paraded around through the halls of Congress as violent and racist insurrectionists tried to destroy our democracy. And even though those images were terrifying, and even knowing all of the many challenges that face our journey to a more just society, you must never stop our efforts to forward the mission of racial equality. Now is committed to identifying and combating the barriers to equality and justice imposed by structural racism, particularly those that inflict a double burden of race and sex, discrimination on BIPOC, Latinx women and girls, including trans women and girls. We champion equal opportunities in all areas, including employment, education, and reproductive rights. This work is more important than ever. For the past year, our country has suffered from the crisscrossing pandemics of COVID-19, racial and economic injustice, and we must build a truly intersectional future where our policy leaders are working to address the gender and racial inequities that, while certainly not new, have been exposed like never before during COVID. And shocking stories of violence against African Americans and communities of color by law enforcement continue to present themselves daily. Since the brutal murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black women and men at the hands of police violence and police, millions have taken to the streets to demand justice. The government, the media, and our society finally recognize that Black lives matter. As NOW's first Black president in 55 years, I have especially followed the Justice for Breonna Taylor movement. For far too long, Black women and girls have been made to feel devalued, silenced, and held to different standards. NOW believes that the life of Breonna Taylor and the lives of so many other Black women lost due to unjust systems matter, and we will not stop raising our voices till we see justice. And NOW we'll take a holistic approach to women's rights, and our advocacy is also conducted through an intersectional lens. In addition to the events today's summit, we engage in an extensive racial equity training for our board, our staff, and members, and advocate strongly for policies that advance racial justice throughout. This work goes beyond our founding, including making sure we have milestone legislative actions and achievements like the 1901 Civil Rights Act, and our efforts for more recent George Floyd justice in the Policing Act and the Black Maternal Health Monuments Bill. Legislation has to include a racial justice framework. For now, intersectional feminism means that every piece of legislation, policy, or program we support must address marginalized and under-resourced populations, including BIPOC, LGBTQIA+ communities, and it is at our core of what we are as an organization. I want to say that again, is at the core of what we are as an organization. Today, we offer 4 exciting sessions with remarkable speakers and panelists who will engage in a discussion about racialized policy in the US. The summit's first panel will focus on the current polarized political landscape, and what it means for the right for reproductive justice. The second panel will unpack the history of our current criminal justice system, the campaign against police brutality, and what we can do to implement reform. The third panel will move to technology, addressing the digital inequities, and oppression, and what they mean for the future of ethical technology. And we will wrap up the summit with a discussion of democratic systems and institutions and how we can reframe our discourse to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities are amplified and elevated in our discussions of rebuilding democracy. Once again, on behalf of NOW's board and staff, I welcome you here today, and we look forward to a robust discussion and to engage you with thought throughout the day for this event. And now I'm very pleased to take you to our first moderator, the wonderful Dr. Anica Mulzac, who will start off moderating our first panel discussion. Dr. Anica Mulzac.
Thank you so much, Christian. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's going to be an amazing day of conversation, and I think it's going to be worth your while. So grateful for being invited to speak with you all today and to get our panel started. I want to also say thank you to Representative Kelly for your commitment to reproductive justice and equality. We are so fortunate to have you on the front lines of this battle. The fact is really that reproductive rights have been under attack for decades now. And conservative strategic efforts to overtake legislatures and institute burdensome and somewhat unnecessary regulations on reproductive health care has really resulted in access inequities, right, vastly across the country. And these restrictions are often exacerbated when we have economic inequities laid on top of it. So I'm thrilled for this panel and all that's going to come out of it. As I said, as been said before, my name is Dr. Anica Mulzac. I am the creator and founder of Race Positive LLC, which really is a consulting firm around talking about race and race relations. And it's my pleasure to just be here today to moderate this panel as well as the one that comes right after. And as Christian said, our first panel is all about discussing the current politicization and polarization, really, of what it means to fight for reproductive justice. Our speakers will provide insight and opportunities for how we can get involved in that fight for reproductive justice, and I would like to introduce them all to you. Our first one is Michelle Batchelor. Michelle is Vice President of the Government Affairs in Our Own Voice, Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. She is responsible for developing, promoting, and partnering with reproductive justice organizations to advance a strategic policy agenda supporting Black women's access to safe abortions, contraceptions, and comprehensive sex education. Previously, she oversaw the domestic and global programming at the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors, including a focus on Black African Americans, youth, and women's HIV health portfolios. Michelle also worked at the Chicago Department of Public Health for 10 years, managing several programs across the STD, HIV, AIDS, substance abuse, and mental health divisions. Welcome, Michelle. Our second panelist is Yasmin Rady. Yasmin serves as National Political Director at Planned Parenthood Action Fund, where she oversees the organization's federal candidate endorsements, PAC activities, national political partnerships, and coordinated campaign efforts. She previously served as the Director of Organizing and Training at PPAF and Planned Parenthood Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She is also the co-founder of Resistance School, a free online practical training program. She previously served as Outreach and Field Director for the National Iranian American Council and as a 2008 Obama campaign in Ohio, as well as for the 2008 Obama campaign in Ohio. Sorry, Yasmin, I completely butchered the end of that, but I really hope that You give me some grace there. And the last person on our panel that I'd love to introduce is Gaby Garcia-Vera. Gaby is the state's program manager for Catholics for Choice, working to advance the moral, ethical, and religious case for protecting reproductive health rights and justice as a Catholic value. For nearly a decade, Gaby has been part of the leadership team for Union Fuerza Latinx Institute, a one-day convening aimed at bringing queer and trans Latinx organizers from around the country together to help advance their leadership in fundraising, campaigns, and culture shift work. Previously, Gaby co-founded the Gokwi, I hope I said that right, Gokwi Language Collective, as executive director of Get Equal and the Florida Field advocacy manager for the Latin Institute. Let's welcome all of our panelists. So thrilled to have you here. We don't have a lot of time, but I'm just going to run right into it. My first question is for you, Yasmin. These last 4 years under the Trump era, we've really seen just an incredible setback in the reproductive rights movement. And we've seen those rights attacked from the state level all the way up to the highest court in the land. Even though we elected a pro-choice candidate to the White House now, we still have lost a lot of key allies in districts all across the country. Can you give us perhaps just a bit of a rundown on what this past election means in the fight for reproductive rights?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you so much, Dr. Mulzac, and thank you to the NOW team. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So first off, I think your framing was perfect, Doctor, around we're in kind of a twin set of realities of a lot of setbacks, but also so much hope and opportunity. I wanted to start off by just saying something that we often don't give ourselves credit for as a reproductive freedom movement, which is our issue is popular. It is extremely popular with the American people. So a record 77% of Americans say they do not want to see Roe be overturned. And also, as we saw an onslaught of abortion bans all across the country this past year, and we'll talk more about a few that we're seeing now. There was not a single state, even the reddest states in the country, not one state in the whole country where banning abortion was popular. And so I wanted to start off before diving into the election, just naming that because, our elections, we have a lot more work to do. We have some great things to celebrate, but also public support is on our side. And it's just about organizing to make sure that we are electoralizing that support effectively. So as Dr. Mulzac said, and as Congresswoman Kelly mentioned in her opening, we are very, very excited that we have a pro-reproductive freedom trifecta in that we have a commitment from the highest office in the land to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And we have our first Black woman VP who has been singing from that songbook since before she was even in the Senate. We also have a fragile but important House majority, as the House majority, of course, was what saved us from unbelievable possible damage during the Trump administration. And we've held that majority, although more fragile than we'd like. And something that I did not expect for us to have is that we won the Senate, and thank goodness that we did. And just, for every single organizer who is active in Georgia, what a blessing we have that we now have the Senate thanks to that win. And I wanted to just, I know everyone followed the Georgia Senate race really closely, but I wanted to also shout out that in Reverend Raphael Warnock, we don't just have an ally of reproductive freedom. We have someone whose first job out of college was as a sex educator, someone who self-identifies as a pro-choice pastor, and who really actually understands the principles of reproductive justice and understands the reproductive justice movement as a movement founded by and led by Black women, women of color. So it's just, we're in a very different reality in the federal landscape than what we could have really imagined just a few years ago. And that is really exciting. And it means we have a mandate to repeal the Hyde Amendment. And I'm really, really excited for Michelle to talk about the incredible work that reproductive justice partners, our organizations, are doing to drive that fight, and for all of us to be supportive of it. So a lot to be hopeful for, but fragile hope in the Senate. And then, I think that I say it's fragile because we have to do a lot of organizing and a lot of push and accountability to make sure that that trifecta lives up to its promise. and that we've only got really 2 years to get a lot of work done before another election is right around the corner. Redistricting is on the horizon, and so we've got to be organizing in the states where maps are being redrawn, as those will have a really big impact on our ability to hold the House in 2022. And then, of course, we have to be really successful and show supporters of reproductive freedom around the country that this government has fought for them, because we have to hold the House and hold the Senate in 2022 in order to have 2 more years of work to do before we win again in 2024. So again, hopeful but fragile in the federal landscape. And in the states, I think things are a darker story, which is going to require a lot deeper organizing from all of us. I think many of the folks here know, because you're involved in these fights, that in 29 states, anti-abortion politicians hold the majority in state legislatures. That is 29 states too many, and that's a lot of work that we need to do to fix. And just in this past, since state legislative sessions have started, more than 150 anti-abortion bills have been introduced or filed, 40% of which are abortion bans. So these are just numbers that should all be zero. And the fact that we are continuing to have these onslaughts of attacks at the state level is the pipeline for how we have ridiculous bills being brought up at the federal level. And quite frankly, the states are the biggest barriers to where, even with Roe as the law of the land, you all know that so much of our, people's access to reproductive health care comes from state bans. So we have a lot of work to do to elect great people in the states. That's going to require all hands on deck. And then I guess I'll just close by saying, when we do win and we elect people like Congresswoman Kelly and we elect great folks in our states, we see just how much that transforms the healthcare landscape. So a quarter of proactive abortion policies passed since Roe versus Wade were just enacted last year. So 1/4 of the history since Roe versus Wade of proactive work is just very, very recent. And we've got a mandate to make sure that that keeps happening in 2022 and beyond. So with that, I will turn to my colleagues to share their thoughts as well.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was great. And, I think that you teed us up beautifully for my next question, which goes to Michelle, and talking about the disproportionate impact, right, of the attacks on reproductive health care. And so, Michelle, of course, Black people and many other people of color, low-income people, queer, trans people have particularly been affected by the damage done to the reproductive rights in this country. Can you talk to us a little bit about why reproductive justice needs to be at the center of our movement, and what does reproductive justice even mean from a public health perspective?
Hi, thank you, Dr. Mulzac. Thank you all for having me, Christian. Now, I really appreciate it. I feel honored to be able to have this discussion with Yasmin and Gaby in particular, who I fan from afar. So, Dr. Mulzac, to answer your question, I'm probably a little bit biased, but I do think reproductive justice needs to be at the center of all our movement activities, because it really is grounded in human rights. And I have to guess, probably everyone attending this cares about human rights, and we see the humanity in folks, and that really is what reproductive justice is about. And I always like to provide kind of the history of it, because that really does kind of ground it. But reproductive justice is a framework that was founded by 12 Black women in 1994. They were in Chicago attending a conference, a pro-choice alliance conference with the Miss Foundation for Women. And the goal of that conference was to create a collective response to the Clinton administration's proposed plan for universal health care. And that also coincided with the conference that these women attended in Cairo that was hosted by the International Conference on Population and Development, where they reached the conclusion that individual rights to plan one's own family must be central to global development. And so these 12 Black women, who at the time called themselves the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, coined this phrase and developed the term because they felt that women, that had limited income, women of color, LGBTQ people, including transgender in particular, non-binary and non-gender conforming individuals, felt neglected and misrepresented by what was at the time the women's rights movement, which had primarily focused on abortion rights as solely a white women's issue. The term really is a combination of reproductive rights and social justice, and that's pretty key to everything that we do, because it acknowledges that a pregnant person cannot freely choose what to do with the pregnancy when options are limited by oppressive circumstances and lack of access to services. So reproductive justice, as it's defined, is the human right to control our bodies, our sexuality, our gender, our work, and our reproduction. And so that right can only be achieved when all marginalized communities have complete economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, our families, our communities, in all areas of our lives. And so that includes the right to choose if, when, and how to start a family. So I do like to provide that framing. I know that's not new probably to a lot of people that are participating today, but it can get a little confusing. And I do like to really emphasize that this was started by Black women in particular that really wanted to speak to the needs of marginalized communities. And it really does cover a lot of issues, which I think is somewhat challenging for folks in a lot of the spaces, because it is economic justice, it's environmental justice, it's voting rights, and health equity. And those all do relate to reproductive health and rights. The reproductive frame focuses on more than just the rights. It's asserting the legal rights to abortion is meaningless, though, if we can't access those services. And we know that all these other issues get in the way of people accessing those services. And so everything like Yasmin was just talking about, these restrictions that, put, costs out of, make it economically not accessible for people to access contraceptives, abortions, even, our well women visits, the distance that people have to travel. I think, last year, some states, people had to travel 150 miles to reach a reproductive health care provider. And then you take into the things, so you have to travel 150 miles. That means you have to take time off work. You have to find childcare services. Depending on whether there's a waiting period or, some other barrier that's been constructed, you will have to find a place to stay so that you can come back for the follow-up visit. All of these things are unnecessary and put barriers that we know, and I think Congresswoman Kelly and Yasmin have spoken about, Christian spoke about, is, primarily affecting Black and Brown people, and so, there are currently more than 100 bills that are restricting voting rights that are currently moving through state legislatures. We continue to see states introduce more and more restrictive barriers to accessing reproductive health care. I mean, just this week, South Carolina passed the first abortion ban of 2021. That would ban abortion at 6 weeks of pregnancy. Most people don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. And a lawsuit has been filed in that. But also you look at minimum wage, I forget who mentioned it, but, with the reconciliation that's happening right now for COVID relief, they're fighting over increasing the minimum wage from $7.25. That is not a livable wage. $15 isn't a livable wage in a lot of places, but it would help. And so all of these restrictions on abortion, restrictions on voting, pay equity, those are just examples of the issues that impact and are addressed through the reproductive justice frame, because they adversely impact particularly Black, Brown, marginalized communities. And as we see right now, the country really is finally, hopefully, coming to terms with racism and the need, and how our policies and our systems maintain white supremacy. And it's pervasive in our policies and our practices. And so, in talking about public health, several states have started to declare that racism is a public health issue. That is a step in the right direction. And so it creates an opportunity for the public health field to take their knowledge and their concern for protecting the health of people and communities and combine those with like the RJ frame, the systems with the human rights and social justice frame, to somewhat ensure that conditions are conducive for all people to do well and to be healthy and to prevent disparities. I've worked in public health for many years, so I know that's easier said than done. We've been talking about health disparities and community engagement for years, and yet they still persist. I can't tell you how many times I've sat in our strategic planning meetings and community engagement is front and center, and yet we still struggle for how to do that and not tokenize individuals. So I do think the reproductive frame provides that opportunity to rethink how we view individuals and communities, how we talk about the issues, who's included at the table, and how decisions are made. And so I'll end by saying, reproductive justice really centers that no one lives a single issue life. And so to protect the public's health and prevent illness, there has to be a consideration for all the factors, seen, unseen, policy systems that influence perceived risk, healthy decision-making. And so the systems and the policies that have oppressed and controlled, particularly Black and Brown bodies, we've got to really continue to have these very uncomfortable conversations. There is no public health policy and program decisions that should be made without community input. Every effort has to be made to engage and include Black and Brown people, but I'll end by saying there should be no engagement that should happen without compensation for those people's time, their expertise, their skills, their insights, because no more free labor by Black and Brown people. We deserve to be compensated just like everyone else. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michelle. And I appreciate just sort of that reminder that no person is sort of existing in a vacuum. Like, we are made up of so much more. And when we think about this stuff, we can't just think of it as a one issue piece. And that leads us right to Gaby, where we think about faith, right? And the faith community has a huge role to play in how we move forward with this. And so, Gaby, oftentimes when we think about religious groups, we think of them as being against reproductive healthcare access. Can you, tell us perhaps from a religious standpoint, explain why Catholics for Choice supports reproductive rights and how this religious sort of dimension would connect to the reproductive rights from a racial justice lens?
And thank you, everyone, for being here today. And thank you to my co-panelists and to our moderator. I'm super excited to be with everybody. My name is Gaby Garcia-Vera. My pronouns are anything as long as it's said respectfully. And as has already been stated, I work at Catholics for Choice, which, much like probably many of the Latinx people that you know, are also Catholic. When we do something, we tend to roll deep. I think the conversation about faith, we need to get like a little bit more nuanced and get a little bit more uncomfortable. When we talk about race and racism in this country, and Michelle talked about, racism is being declared like a public health crisis in some states. And yet at the same time, I think the needle that we want to thread and the needle that I oftentimes like hold with people is, words without changes in behaviors are simply manipulations. And I say that to frame really the discourse around what it means to be a person of faith. I think our opposition is clearly in like a faithful alignment in relationship. We know from like just being on the ground in states, right? Like the opposition is using religious dogma at every turn, right? And much like we have seen the right do, right, cares very little about whether, scripture says one thing here and another thing there. And honestly, I don't think that those are the helpful arguments to have. No one gets to have your faith because it doesn't fit in a nice, neat little box, right? Like I'm queer and I'm Catholic and I work in like the reproductive health rights and justice movement. Like, I'm sure when I walk into church, the priest is like, oh, aquí viene. But I think we have to really decenter who gets to be the moral arbiter of our lives. And oftentimes what we see in a lot of this conversation is that because our opinions don't fall in alignment, oftentimes in our experience, right, with the Catholic hierarchy, they are devalued, right? Like, and you know what? Like people will try to discredit you. They will try to dehumanize you at every turn so that they can make okay when they do like real wild ass shit to you and like basically treat people like garbage, right? We know that the Catholic Church within itself is an institution that can change, right? Because we have seen them, in the 1960s, the Catholic Church, like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, put out a statement saying that they disavowed racism, which great, but they were a little late on the uptake for any folks doing the math there. And, and I ask people, I'm like, do you believe our church to be a place that seeks to profit from war? And people are like, absolutely not. And I'm like, great. So explain to me the Crusades. So when we have conversations about what it means to be a faithful person, what is our moral obligation to ourselves and our own spiritual relationship and connection? Who gets to lead us, right? I think in the same way that we show up and we ask people when we're doing the work, around like advancing conversations just about race and racism, right? Because it's super complicated. We live in a society that is inherently built on the like foundation of racism and patriarchy. So to believe that anyone is absolved of it is, at least from my perspective, like not really doable because it permeates every single thing in our society. And so like once we understand that, shifting our conversation, shifting who becomes the moral arbiter, right? And meeting people where they're at, but also not letting it be okay to like devalue or dehumanize someone. Because I just think, the Jesus that I knew was like flipping tables and like hanging out with the people, probably at the bodega, if I'm being like 100. And I think the other thing that I think is really interesting, and I think oftentimes we use oppositional language a lot, and it's a thing that we really struggle with. But I also think we show up into conversations with people and we don't do the legwork necessary to hold space with people. We ask like Black, Indigenous, people of color, like folks across the spectrum to sit and do labor with us and engage. And I think part of what we really have to hold is like our responsibility in showing up to that conversation. It's not enough that we just ask to be educated. We also have to like show up and have done some research. We have to show up and have done some work. We have to show up and like really consider in that conversation, like what does being an accomplice versus being an ally look like, right? How are people using all of their street cred, right, in their circles to amplify the work happening? Because I think, we talk about white supremacy as like the ideal for how we talk about, even in our grant writing, how we talk about harm, rather than, we say marginalized communities, people impacted by poverty, right? Like, why not say like communities subverting the impact of white supremacy and colonialism, right? Like, why do we frame things from an angle of oppression? Why do we talk about our liberation from oppression? And I think these are like all tipping points on how we really shift the narrative of like our own church, our institutions, right? Like the Catholic Church it's not the hierarchy, right? It's not the pews, it's not a book, it's the people. And I think similar could be said for any of our organizations. And so when people show up in those conversations, when we show up, and say like, oh yeah, we're going to change, but we don't follow that with impact or like with a plan or like concrete next steps. And I think like Michelle said, like when we show up and we ask people for free labor, which, ain't nobody got time for. Audacity is at an all-time high. We need to like stop. I think that reflects more on like that people haven't done the work to show up to that conversation yet.
Thank you so much, Gabby. I really appreciate you just sharing that. And I think you highlight some really important points, which is I think when the argument or the conversation is sort of framed from your opponent's perspective, it's very hard to win that argument, isn't it? And I think what you're calling us all to is to really just change the frame and take it out of this you versus me, but really come to the heart of the matter. Let's talk about what the facts are, and then from there we can find our way forward. So I really like that charge to all of us to reframe how we even start talking about this. As we conclude, with my questions, I wanted to just pose a question to everyone for us to think about today. We talked a lot already about some of the damage that's been done, right, to reverse reproductive health rights across the country. But what can we do to progress? How do we make reproductive health even better than it's ever been in the United States from this point forward? And that's for everyone.
I'm happy to kick things off in part because I'm feeling very fired up on my fellow panelists. Just want to thank each of you for your reflections, and you have my creative juices flowing on the answer to this question. But I just wanted to, before answering directly, I think for me, the solution to all problems is organizing, and really deep organizing that is locally rooted and that is centering the people most impacted by an issue. And I think that's how we will win. And as Michelle was talking, and Michelle, by the way, I asked my colleagues who get to work more closely with Michelle any background, and they just said, honestly, she's just a delight, and you're going to see on this panel. And I feel like we just witnessed that. But I think we're experiencing not just major political challenges, but we are also, as my co-panelists have said, we're in twin pandemics, and in twin pandemics of a COVID pandemic and a moment of racial reckoning that is rooted on the pandemic of racism. The solutions are organizing, but they're also following the leadership of leaders who have really been deeply rooted in communities who understand how intersectional solutions are. As Michelle said, people don't live single issue lives. They're also not single issue solutions. And in order to come out on the other end of this moment, we've got to be following the leadership of the organizers and the leaders who have brought that intersectional approach. In the repro space, that's RJ leaders. I mean, it's RJ reproductive justice leaders have been without enough credit leading that charge. And I think it is long overdue time to follow that leadership. So I think that's at a high level. And then I think that if organizing is the solution for how we get through it, I think it also ought to be values-based organizing. And so I really appreciated, Gaby. It's such a treat to meet you. I wish we were in person to get to meet you in person, but I just think the work that Catholics for Choice is doing, and also that all organizers are doing to center the values that call us into this work. I mean, none of us do this, for the paycheck. None of us do this for the whatever. We do this because we're called to it. And for so many of us, that comes from our values. And as Gaby, you were talking, it reminded me, I used to do congregation-based organizing, and one of the pastors I used to work with used to always bring up, whenever we would kind of be knocking our heads against the wall about how faith is just brought out as a conservative value rather than a value that motivates folks on the left as well. He said that there's a difference between tradition and traditionalism. Tradition is the living ideas of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead ideas of the living. And often we are talking about values work through the lens of traditionalism rather than tradition, of whether that's through Catholicism, whether that's through the traditions of what the amazing history that Michelle brought up of the reproductive justice movement that we can learn from, or whether it's our own family and cultural traditions. I think the way that we bring that into the organizing and the deep organizing, not like online just petition signing, deep organizing in communities. I think through that we will win elections, and we will also win the issue fights, because we've got a lot of friends to hold accountable to, and some are friends and some are folks in, all of us do nonpartisan, cross-partisan work. We've got work to do with the Democratic Party too. John Bel Edwards, governor of Louisiana, himself supports the 6-week ban that passed the legislature in Louisiana last year. So I say all that I think if we stick to organizing, we do that deep work, we elect the kind of people who center our issues, we center the people who are most impacted by these fights, which is unequivocally, it's people of color, Black and brown people, and low-income folks, who all of those healthcare disparities that Michelle talked about will not be able to be overcome if we are not centering the people who would be most impacted by something like an abortion ban in that political work.
I feel like mic drop, like Yasmin, you just said all the things. Yeah. Like, I don't even know where to add. Like, that was phenomenal framing. And Gaby, you have like, stretched my mind also to like rethink how I'm talking about the issues. I said in my comments, but I think there's always opportunity for growth. So I really appreciate both of you and what you said. And I was just, as you were talking, I was looking at one of the comments in the chat about, we can't depend on our elected officials. And, yes and no. I think we have to. This is the system we're in, and we have to hold them accountable. Because I think I agree with you, Yasmin. I think it is organizing. We've seen it. I mean, we have to. I can't be in a meeting and not mention Stacey Abrams. It's just like, has just shown us what we can do with just determination and following our gut, as someone said. And I think if we can't trust our elected officials, we need to get them out of there. We need to put people in place, and that might be us, not me, but it might be you all. It might be, it might be that the neighborhood. I remember when I was doing case management, and it was, finding the gatekeepers in the community, and they may not have that, pedigree. But damn it, they're not some of the smartest people and most insightful people I've ever met. Imagine if they would just get the support they need to be able to get the platform that we have for any number of reasons. And so I think, Yasmin, I think you've said it all, but I add to that, we have to hold our elected officials accountable. And if not, we got to get them out of there. And that's, I think we saw that a lot with Georgia, with Pennsylvania, Arizona, I think, and I really hope that, that energy stays in place. And I think even with the reframing of how we talk about things, again, why I really appreciate reproductive justice is because I don't think everything is about my womb. I really don't. I think there's a lot more that we need to talk about so that we can improve all lives. And so I really want to hear what Gaby has to say. And I know, Dr. Mulzac, you want us to move on, so I'm going to be quiet and let Gaby join in.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Gaby, before you share your thoughts with us, I just want to let everyone know that I'm sure you're also chomping at the bit to ask this amazing panel a bunch of questions as well. So while Gaby gives the answer, perhaps you can type your answers or your questions that you have for our panelists in the chat box. Please know that we have very little time left, but we'll do our very best to get to as many questions as possible. But Gaby, it's your turn. I don't know. You have the mic now, so it's no pressure.
So I think co-sign to everything that was said, and let me know where to sign up to like go phone bank, like call somebody, go hassle somebody. You know, I have a nice collection of bullhorns, waiting, collecting dust. You know, I want to offer some like practical sort of tips to folks, because I think when I started to unpack my own journey around what showing up for racial justice looked like to me in the work, I really I was struggling, right? I think like a lot of people trying to inform yourself from because once you know something, once you know a truth, you can never unknow it, right? The question is, are you willing to do something about it? And so like the place in the lane in which I found myself was really organizing other people that looked like me, that sounded like me, right? Because I think everyone can attest that every couple of months on YouTube, like pops up a video of like a Puerto Rican somewhere, like yelling at someone, something super racist, right? And like, we don't just get to disown those people. Those are our people, right? Like we have to be willing to come and gather our folks as much as we are willing to sit and be patient with folks, as much as we are willing to be tender with them. And I think when we think about the work long-term, I really challenge people, you know, what are things that you can actively be doing to organize conversations with people that look like you and sound like you to help do the work around racial justice, whether it's like in your family, whether it's in your place of worship, right? Because we know that sometimes the leaders in our faith in our religious institutions aren't actually holding the values that they claim, right? Like they're picking and choosing, and it becomes very clear. And we have to hold those people accountable, right? I think we have lost so much already, and I think we do not need to rewrite history. We don't need to rethink it. And at the same time, we need to ask for like big, bold inspiration. Like, I'm tired of asking for breadcrumbs. You know what I mean? Like people that run that strategy end up hungry. And, you know, I'm always in my kitchen. And so like, everything is about food for me. And so I'm like, cool. So like, how are we gonna feed the community, right? And as my sister says, you know, donde hay un plato, hay cuatro tenedores. And so like where there is one plate, there's always four forks. And we need to really think about how we amplify that strategy to our community in a way that makes it more accessible. Because I think we're leaving a lot of people behind just because we're not stopping to think or to hold space for them, or to even just build the container that like allows them to show up.
Thank you, Gaby. I really appreciate that perspective. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat box yet, but if you do have a question, please share it. But I have a question, and Gaby, that, you know, the idea of, I have two questions, and I'm trying to figure out how can I merge them into one. But one question really would be, in lieu of the traditional way of framing the conversation around this stuff, what would you suggest would be a better way that we can frame it that would invite people who are opposing or who are left behind, as you just said, to be a little bit more engaged or at least open to the conversation?
I think when we think about how we show up to those conversations, right? Like ultimately we can't have civil discourse if we are being like disrespectful. I think like there's something to be said about respectability politics that I think when we think about structurally inside of systems cause a lot of harm, mostly right to people that look like the folks on this panel, right? Everybody knows what it's like to be like, oh, you're kind of being a little too loud, or like you're too, you know, like if you don't say anything, people are like, oh, okay, they're mad. If you say too much, people are like, oh, you got a lot of feelings. I think when we think about how to frame conversations, I think we need to be okay with not having all the answers. I think there's a lot of people showing up, and I think the fear of getting it right is getting in the way of doing the work, right? Like, show up and know that you don't know it all. Show up and say like, hey, I might fuck it up. And if I fuck it up, I'm going to do the work to like learn the things I don't know. I'm going to build for that. Right. But like, everyone's on a journey. You know, and my mom voted for Trump in 2016. And we had at it in the car, and she basically burst into tears. And I was like, you don't get to cry. I was like, eso no vale. I was like, you don't get to cry. I was like, we can hold this as a complex thing, but we need to be willing, one, to admit the things that we don't know. We need to like show up with a little bit of tenderness and compassion for other people, which honestly, I don't know about y'all, but feels a little hard sometimes these days, especially after a year being bored in the house. And I think we just need to really be willing to come back to each new engagement with that person and say, you know what, I did a little bit of work. That thing that you said to me, I thought about it. And so like, I wanted to tell you, this is what I think, or like I went and I did some research. Imagine how much more powerful and productive our conversations would be if we showed up and said, hey, I was listening to you. And because I went and researched that thing that we were talking about because it mattered to me.
Great. I think that's such a good point. I think sometimes humility is often missing. Humility and grace, I think, are two words that are not often invited into these conversations. And if they were, I think a lot of things can change. And I often find, just in my own work as a psychologist, but also with my company, that when people are having these conversations, they're talking past each other. They're not even having the same conversation. And that's why there's no ability to even come to an agreement, because we weren't even talking about the same thing. One was talking economics, the other was talking about access, and it's just completely missing the mark. And so I agree, being willing to listen truly, understand, you don't have to agree, but understand where the other person's come from, what drives them, you're better able to make a case for why you think they are inaccurate and help them to see it. Now, we are not miracle workers. We can't make people do what they don't want to do, but we can at least create the opportunity for that conversation to be had. And so I think your advice and the advice of everyone else on this panel helps us to move forward, get active, and be educated about what you're talking about. Helps you to really be more effective in this fight. So thank you so much to our incredible panelists. You all know who have shown up today that reproductive rights is one of NOW's core issues, and we really want to just continue engaging around this topic in the year ahead. And your questions, if you have them, please, go ahead and send them. We'll figure out a way to get it to our panelists. But we're going to take about a 5-minute break now and regroup for our next panel that's going to be on police accountability. Thank you, everyone. Again, thank you to our amazing panelists. We so appreciate you.